Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. Welcome to Better Place, where we talk with practitioners of international law, loosely defined, and where today we're going to continue Series 2 focus on business and human rights, a real growth area in international law, in human rights law, and in that really innovative, controversial, topical area of businesses' social responsibilities. Really pleased to introduce to you a friend and colleague, Charity Ryerson, who we're going to be chatting to today. Hello, Charity.
Hi, Jonathan. Glad to be here.
Charity, you are the founder and CEO of the Corporate Accountability Lab, a US-based organization dedicated to unleashing the creative potential of the law to protect people and the planet from corporate abuse. I love that one-liner. I took that, completely copied that straight from your the Corporate Accountability Lab website, but a wonderful mission statement. How long did that take to come up with? Weeks, days?
We've had a lot of iterations of that. I think that this most recent iteration will probably evolve again in the near term. But I think it was one afternoon with the staff over beers.
Over beers, that's the key ingredient for success in this field. Sometimes alcohol. Well, I look forward to unpacking what that mission is all about and what you do, and a little bit about your personal journey. I know you, but I thought it might be worthwhile to introduce you in a more fulsome fashion to the audience. So if you don't mind, you can block your ears if you want, but a little bit of a professional bio. Charity Ryerson is the executive director and founder of Corporate Accountability Lab, a US-based civil society organization. Before CAL, as we'll call it, Corporate Accountability Lab, before CAL, Charity litigated complex international human rights cases under the Alien Tort Statute, Torture Victims Protection Act, and US state tort law. Her passion for business and human rights was ignited by the student anti-sweatshop movement, which occupied a lot of her time while she was supposedly studying for a B.A. in political science in Chicago. She also has a law degree from Georgetown Law and is admitted to practice in multiple jurisdictions in the United States, including the US Supreme Court. In 2003, Charity served 6 months in US federal prison for civil disobedience at the US Army School of the Americas. During that time, she worked in a prison factory for 12 cents an hour. I look forward to hearing a little bit more about that. She has extensive experience in labour and human rights monitoring, anti-union violence investigations, and support for labour organising in Central and South America. In 2021, she received the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable's Gwynne Skinner Human Rights Award for her work over the years, and including founding and leading the Corporate Accountability Lab. She's fluent in Spanish and has 2 children. It says on your website that you still love Chicago enough to tolerate the brutal winters. I suspect it's got more to do with the deep dish pizza, but I don't know. Is there anything I missed, Charity?
I think that's very comprehensive, Jonathan.
That's a professional introduction. What about a more personal one? If you had 3 words to describe yourself, what would they be?
That's a good question. I think they would be risk taker. They would be caring, and another single word.
Yeah, because
generally happy. Risk taker is hyphenated.
Yeah, right. Okay, cool. So
I'm a caring, happy risk taker. That's what I would say.
I like that. Corporate Accountability Lab, 3 other words. Let's get stuck into what you do. But if I may just go back a little bit, and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as a lot of people will know that's listening to this, sort of the foundation document, global governance document in this space, says there's 3 pillars. Pillar 1, countries, states have a duty to protect human rights, including from corporate abuses. Pillar 2, businesses should respect human rights. And Pillar 3, all victims of corporate human rights abuses should have access to remedy. You're a Pillar 3 type of person. Corporate Accountability Lab is all about Pillar 3. Would that be right?
Yeah, we're absolutely a Pillar 3 organization. And a lot of people say that Pillar 3 is the weakest pillar, right? You've got a stool with 3 legs and one of them's just a little bit shorter. So I think that the Pillar 3 space is a little underoccupied. There's certainly lots of other organizations doing this work, but we pale in comparison to Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 activity. And I think that that's something that really needs to be strengthened. So part of why I founded CAL is to try to fill that gap.
Okay. And that's a cerebral reason why you founded CAL, but Pillar 1, Pillar 2 perhaps occupied, but were there personal reasons why you founded CAL? Like,
so many.
Yeah, well, we've got time for a few.
Well, how about I just tell you a little bit about the story of CAL and why I founded it in the way that I did, and then I can talk about other personal reasons. So, going a little bit back in my own history, in my bio, you mentioned my background with the student anti-sweatshop movement. That was like this extraordinary crash course in global supply chains, where as a student activist, I was protesting at Nike Town in downtown Chicago about a factory in Mexico called the Cook Dog Factory. And we had this huge victory. It was the first big victory of the student anti-sweatshop movement, maybe in 2001. And that was really exciting. It showed this way that in a consuming country, right, a country that has this massive consumer market, we can put pressure on our own brands and maybe actually improve conditions for workers in a producing country. So that's like an extraordinary amount of power. And it suggests that there might be a way in which in these big consumption countries, we have not just the ability to, but a responsibility to hold our own companies accountable. And so starting there, I then went on to do this international labor rights work in Latin America, mostly on farms and some in factories doing monitoring, but also worker solidarity, cross-border solidarity kind of work. And then when I went to law school, I really went to law school because our consumer campaigns weren't working. We were doing so much. I was like on the ground with the flour workers and the Sabana de Bogota in Colombia, trying to figure out how can we get Dole Food Company to enforce the pesticide container label that says no one can go into the farm or into this tent for 24 hours after spraying. And so I'm working with all of these women workers who are experiencing congenital malformations and miscarriages, and we never won on that. We could not get basic compliance with the label on the packaging of a pesticide, and that was really demoralizing. And so I started to see these cases against companies, and I thought, if we can't get them to change behavior through campaigns and public shaming, because at this point in history, boycotts don't ever really move the needle that much, then how can we develop sort of harder hitting tools? So I went to law school for that purpose. Right. Because I wanted to be an Alien Tort Statute litigator, right?
No way.
Folks, that's why I went to law school. It was unfortunate. Do you want me to give a little background on that for folks who are not from the US?
Yeah, well, before you get to ATS, what I found really, really fascinating is you move from soft law theory of change type of thing, asking, pleading, begging, demanding, but soft law outside the law, to realizing the limits of that, and let's go pursue through the law corporate accountability. I'm curious if you still have the similar sort of reflections on the limits of soft law. And I guess in 20 minutes, I'll ask you what your reflections are on the hard law in terms of corporate accountability. But are you still down on soft law as a limited tool for corporate accountability?
Well, I would say that, if the UNGPs have taught us anything, there's a lot that we can do to generate massive change in the way companies present themselves. But a lot of soft law is not having significant changes in how they actually operate. So when you're looking at, if you tried to look at rates of oil spills, of serious labor rights abuses in supply chains, do we see a real shift? And I would say that neither hard law nor soft law interventions have made really significant changes. The amount of impact that I think this whole field has had has been kind of limited. And it's very sad, even though when you look at what companies are saying publicly, that has changed dramatically. So on PR, we're doing very well.
We'll get to successes and failures in a second.
Yeah.
I do want to circle back to ATS, but perhaps also that's why alcohol is a good thing to have in moderation, of course. So you mentioned ATS, and so let me go bring you back to that. Corporate Accountability Lab was set up 5, 6, 7 years ago, I think, to pursue corporate accountability through hard law mechanisms, including the Alien Tort Statute. So I'll handball it to you, Charity. Tell us what the Alien Tort Statute is. But I'm curious, if I may push you further, ATS, really interesting and innovative, but you're doing more than that. Corporate Accountability Lab is all about innovating in this space. So are there other legal pathways that you have used or are thinking of using?
Yeah, I would just correct you there. We are not using the Alien Tort Statute, and that's because it's really dead. So when I graduated from law school, I came out, I was an Alien Tort Statute litigator. I got my dream job working for this little human rights NGO that was suing all these big companies under the ATS. So I really focused my whole law school career on litigating under the ATS and the torture statute. And then shortly thereafter, we started to see the signals that the Supreme Court was looking at this case, and the issues before the court were very concerning for our whole field. We thought they were probably going to rule on corporate liability in this Kiobel case, which had to do with oil spills and killing of activists in the Niger Delta in the Ogoni lands in Nigeria. And when that decision came down saying that the Alien Tort Statute, which used to give aliens, so non-US citizens, the ability to bring a tort in the United States in federal court for a violation of the law of nations, which has been interpreted by the courts to mean customary international law, more or less, though a little bit narrower. So you had this great statute. It was like, hey, foreigners, come sue in the US if you can get jurisdiction over your defendant, so long as that defendant committed some kind of international law violation. So that could be genocide or torture or crimes against humanity, extrajudicial executions, these kinds of cases. So the Alien Tort Statute, was alive and well and doing a lot for, say, 25, 30 years. It was like kind of effective, though not, if you really look at the history of it, it was a little patchy, but it certainly provided an opportunity. So when I graduate law school after setting up this whole career in going down this path, and then the Supreme Court brings this ruling in the Kiobel v. Shell case and guts it and says that the statute doesn't apply to extraterritorial acts, meaning if the human rights abuse took place outside of the territory of the United States, then the ATS doesn't apply. There's maybe like a little exception that is a little too technical to get into here. And I see your face, Jonathan. I won't do it. I'm not going to do it to your listeners. It's tempting. It's tempting, but I have to stop myself.
And I'm biting my tongue too, only to say that I think the ATS's death, I still think there is a glimmer of life in the ATS.
Yeah, well, we don't have to argue that out now.
That's a different podcast.
I think that I would say this. At this point, for this particular statute, if you are a defendant corporation in the United States and you have gotten involved in a serious human rights abuse overseas, and you have a victim of that human rights abuse that wants to bring you into court in the U.S., you would have to jump through so many hoops, like so many stars have to align to make it possible for that case to succeed. So no one wants to file that case.
And it's costly.
Such a remote.
It's costly.
So
takes years. Right.
Years and years. Right.
Right. So, okay. So, again, to defend myself, you did file a few amicus briefs in Alien Tort Statute cases most recently, I believe, Nestle and Doe, which was about cocoa farming, the sourcing of cocoa beans from Cote d'Ivoire and child slavery. So if you're not using ATS, what are you using? What corporate accountability legal mechanisms are you using?
So we're using kind of everything that can possibly be used. So as a lab, we're very practical. The idea is not just to find a new ATS, it's really to diversify the legal strategies that are available to human rights litigators. And that's an ongoing project. So it's not that we find one statute that might work and we just need to test it and we test it and build. We don't do that. What we do instead is we find as many things as possible, and we have many different projects going in various pilot stages to see what is most promising, with the idea being that we pass these off to partner organizations when we find something really successful so that we can stay in the innovation space. So we're working on cases and projects related to supply chain contracting. We have a project right now, it's a pilot with the city of San Francisco to put provisions to allow workers who are producing for the city to be third-party beneficiaries of the labor and human rights terms of those contracts so they can bring their own suits and have legal rights to do so. We are filing consumer... Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, we might need to unpack that. So in 25 words or less, that's it. Let me see if I can do that and you correct me. So if a company puts human rights in a code of conduct, puts that out in contracts and for the whole world to see, if they don't live up to that soft law, if you will, code of conduct, then someone that should have benefited from that code of conduct can sue. Is that
exactly
okay?
And they can sue the supplier. They can sue the supplier. So, for example, with the city contract, we've done this in some other supply chains as different pilots, but in this particular one, the city is going to contract with a top tier supplier that's producing T-shirts for the city. Let's say this T-shirt producer, which could be some really big recognizable company, because that's a lot of city suppliers are in that category.
Yep.
So the supplier produces T-shirts. The worker in Malaysia or Bangladesh that is in a factory producing these T-shirts, they experience wage theft or forced overtime or discrimination, something that's prohibited in that code of conduct, exactly as you said. They have legal rights as third-party beneficiaries of this contract and of those terms of the contract to bring a claim against the supplier. So it's a way that if their local, if their government, if the local legal system is not able to or willing to provide them with a remedy for the harm they've suffered, they can still get a remedy in a different court.
And there would be jurisdiction in a US court for those Malaysian workers to come into a US court. And has there been success with this strategy?
So it's going to take a while to get to the point that the workers are bringing cases. So what there has been success with, I think our first concern was, would any supplier ever sign a contract that has this term? Because suddenly they have maybe thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in global South countries that are now positioned to sue them for pretty run-of-the-mill violations, because the sort of standard operating procedure in global supply chains is pretty oppressive. And so you've got these highly exploitative factory conditions. These suppliers know absolutely that the reason that they're sourcing from like this part of China is because it's extremely cheap, right? And if it's extremely cheap, there's probably some labor rights issues going on there. So we were actually concerned that we would these wouldn't be commercially viable. And that is something that we've now thoroughly tested, and they're very commercially viable. We haven't had any issue with people signing on to this contract language. However, the contract language also includes factory disclosure requirements. It includes access to factories for education on workers' rights, public notices all around the factory in workers' native languages, explaining their rights and how they can exercise their rights. It's kind of the devil's in the details, right? So before we get to the point, so commercial viability, yes, we feel really good about that. But the rest of these, are they actually disclosing accurately all of their factories? And then can we verify that they're posting notices, that workers are getting educated, that supervisors are getting educated, which is also in there? I think that's what's still kind of being piloted.
Yeah. And I'm curious, some other theories or litigation legal strategies, that you're pursuing. And let me ask you this way. There's now modern slavery reporting, for example, in many jurisdictions, including Australia, where I'm from, California. Is that a basis for third-party beneficiary litigation or some other form of litigation that you're pursuing?
So a lot of the disclosure-related modern slavery bills that have been passed globally create more of a safe haven than they do actual litigation risk. That's certainly been the case in California under the California Supply Chain Transparency Act, which is very similar to like the UK Modern Slavery Act, these kind of bills. So these laws, for our purposes, have not done very much that's positive. In fact, in California, that law has precluded a lot of consumer protection cases, saying that this created a safe harbor and occupies the space. So that hasn't been great. We are pursuing some different types of consumer protection claims that are a little different than some of the other consumer protection work that has been done in the past, really targeting certifiers and social auditors This is legally a little bit more tricky, but thinking about kind of how do we deal with this massive greenwashing that we all get misled constantly by representations made by companies about sustainability. Right. How do we shut that down? Because it also insulates them from regulation, right? Regulators see this and they're like, oh, looks like they're doing really great. Look at all those happy farmers. So we want to push back on some of that. We are doing, in terms of forced labor specifically, go ahead, sorry.
No. So who are you pursuing? Are you pursuing the what I would call the private sector governance actors, the sustainability standard setters, or are you pursuing the company that's taking advantage in your mind of that?
Right now, we are in active litigation against Hershey's and Rainforest Alliance together. So they are co-defendants in a case. So Rainforest Alliance for certifying the farms. We do a lot of investigation in West Africa. Our investigators bring back lots of photos of hazardous child labor and forced labor. We got a bunch of photos that we traced to Rainforest Alliance certified farms of very small kids carrying very heavy loads, using machetes, being exposed to pesticides. So we decided to sue Rainforest Alliance for misleading consumers. And they, through their partnership with Hershey's, it seemed like that would be like a good combination. We are considering very seriously a case in a different industry under a similar theory where we would also have both the brand and the certifier named.
Yeah. Fantastic. I didn't mean to cut you off. Other pathways, because this is the essence of what Cal does, the lab part. You're trying to innovate, test the waters, fail potentially, but then hand off those theories of corporate account, those pathways for corporate accountability to others to pursue. So are there other like even more risky or ethereal ideas that you have that you wanted to share?
There's so many. I don't know how much depth you want. So I'll give a few more maybe quicker examples. In terms of forced labor, we're definitely using, in the United States, we have an import ban that bans the importation of products made with forced labor or convict labor under Section 307 of the 1930 Tariff Act. We do a lot with Customs and Border Protection and bringing those petitions, but trying to leverage it a little differently. So there are some other folks in this space who are filing these petitions to block the importation of these forced labor produced goods. We are trying to work with CBP to actually get remedy through that process and change the way that it's applied a little bit, because really just blocking imports is very risky in the sense that you can negatively impact farmers or factory workers without providing any remedy whatsoever. And so the harm to the company is kind of a slap on the wrist, and the harm to the workers can be really egregious. And so again, is there a way?
Pillar three, it's all about the victims. Right.
Yeah. So how can we take this really blunt tool and leverage it in a more nuanced way? So we're doing that. We're also looking at international trade courts, potentially developing some cases that could be filed in the near term under a few different theories, but you can use international trade courts or domestic courts using unfair methods of competition or unfair competition claims. So think about like a little ethical t-shirt company going up against, production in Vietnam where trade unions are illegal. Is there a way to say that that's an unfair method of competition to bring in products? So we're experimenting in a few different forums with cases like that. I mean, the general theme overall is we try to use commercial law, so areas of law that companies need for their own benefit, and then turn them back against companies where they're wrongdoers. If we use human rights law, the problem is companies are such repeat players in the system that they can systematically gut human rights law, which is what happened with the Alien Tort Statute. So can we use contract law and intellectual property law and international trade law? Those are things that companies, as repeat players, are not going to gut because they need them.
And so what I'm curious if you could help us sort of demystify. So how do you do that brainstorming, that thinking? What does that day-to-day, week-to-week work of Cal do? Is there just a bunch of smart people sitting around a boardroom table with Post-it notes, sticking up ideas? How do you develop these ideas, and then how do you move from the idea to actually follow through with it?
That's a great question. So from the beginning, when I founded the organization, we started with a design, like a legal design cycle. So this is design thinking, but adapted for use in the law. So legal design is its own relatively niche field. I think it's picking up a little bit in Europe. It hasn't caught on as big, maybe in other parts of the world. But legal design really takes some of that Silicon Valley style design thinking innovation process and changes it a little bit. It's almost more focused on mindsets than it is on the design cycle, the steps. But we do actually go through a modified legal design cycle that we have adapted for human rights. And we adapted it because if you think about, you're in Silicon Valley, you're a tech worker and you're designing an app, right? Move fast, break things, fail all the time. It's no big deal. Or let's say you're designing a tennis shoe for a nurse who stands on her feet all day. The stakes are not as high as if you're designing a solution for some very egregious human rights situation, right? So when you think about an indigenous community whose land has been destroyed by a mine, and you're trying to come up with legal solutions to try to get remedy, to try to stop the ongoing harm, considering there might be serious health effects, there could be violence that's taking place as a result of this mining operation. All of these different pieces, this is very high stakes stuff. So you don't just work quick and break things. Right. So we had to adapt the cycle. We now have pulled in systems thinking, but we still do something that looks a little bit like a regular design cycle for anyone who's familiar with design thinking, where we go through an extensive problem definition process to make sure that everybody, all the interdisciplinary folks that we brought into the room, understand the problem in the same way. We go through a brainstorming or ideation process that has a lot of very structured activities that does involve a lot of post-it notes. So on that count, you were right. Our prototyping process involves a lot of drawing. We bring in clay. Sometimes we build little websites or Canva decks so that we can really think through in a very granular step-by-step way. How is this going to play out before we try it in the real world? And then when we test something, this is usually going to look like it's a very limited test, the most limited way you can possibly do it. And same for piloting. So if we're going to try something new, we don't want to, first of all, super overthink it. I think sometimes you'll see folks in civil society who work through a project for 5 years and then they put out a guide. And everybody can go and use this guide, but no one's actually tried this legal strategy ever. It hasn't been tried in the real world. So we flip that. We do it the opposite way. We're going to pilot it in the simplest, most lightweight way that we can a few times before we even take it out and start saying, can other folks start piloting this? This is a really great idea. This shows potential. We want to gather that data, but we want to do it. We learn a lot by doing. So in that sense, our process is a little bit different than I think what you see in a lot of other kinds of NGOs.
So I have two questions for you, stemming from what you just said. One's, I guess, a personal one, and one's a financial one. Let's go with the personal first. You're a law student. You're a lawyer by training. What you just said requires all sorts of other skills. You're also a manager. You're a fundraiser. You're a founder. You're a people manager. Where did you learn all these skills?
By doing. A lot of it's by doing. I will say that some of it, in terms of internal processes, I learned in social movements. So design thinking, I've heard described as social movement processes repackaged by Silicon Valley and sold back to us. And I will say that a lot of the design thinking mindsets you see in social movement consensus process. The way that you want to make sure that whatever idea is down in the corners of someone's brain, they feel confident enough, they have enough trust in this community to be able to pull it out, and enough leadership and agency. And so that is a big part of our organizational culture. And I learned that in social movement. So in that way, the kind of like HR, the way that we do decision making and a lot of our design thinking is really informed by just my own activism.
Yeah. And so extracurricular work and activities are really important. And you've coupled. Yeah, brilliant. And then the financial question, who's funding this?
Yeah, so we're almost entirely funded by private foundations. This is because we don't take any corporate money. We don't want to have the reality or the appearance of influence over the work that we do. Now, a lot of private foundations, it's all, if you go back a few layers, it's all corporate money or it's government money, right? So in a way, it's being like laundered through the private foundation so that we feel comfortable enough to accept it.
Yeah.
We do have a little bit of individual donor money, which is, less than 10% of our total income.
Right.
So, I mean, on the downside, I think that if we had more individual donor income, we would have a lot more freedom to do whatever we want. But we then don't have a lot of overhead. So we're 7 attorneys and 1 support staff. Whereas if we had if a big part of our budget came from individual donations, we need development staff.
And presumably you might get a cut of a successful strategy, a strategy that ends up with a big payout. You might see some of that money and
theoretically we could, but at this point we're not doing contingency fee arrangements with clients and this sort of thing because all of our cases are really experimental and we plan to stay in the experimental space. I think it's one thing if once we find a good strategy, then we want to just push it off and let other folks run with it. That financially is not a great strategy, right? We really should be finding like a bread and butter legal strategy that works really well and then get contingency or attorney's fees on it, but that's not our model.
I've got the hurry up from Zoom, so I'm going to push forward if you don't mind, Charity. What gets you really buzzed right now? Is there something super exciting on the horizon or on your daily agenda that makes you jump out of bed that much quicker?
Gosh, honestly, there's so many things. I think one thing and this isn't maybe right now, this is just always, one thing that I love about the way that we operate is we really straddle the space between doing this very ivory tower design thinking, yada, yada, and then working really closely with impacted communities. And so we get to, now that COVID's over, COVID's kind of over, at least we act like it is. Now that we're in this space, we're getting to go and travel and work more directly with these communities every day. And I think that there's so much innovation that is happening within the communities who are directly impacted by corporate abuse that being able to be embedded in those spaces makes us so much better as legal innovators in our own environment. So that's usually what gets me up out of bed. Being
close to the people you're helping. And what gets you down? I'm curious. And I guess the follow-up is even more important. What gets you back up again?
It's a really good question.
Are there coping mechanisms? You must cop a battering. The type of work you do, it's rather thankless, I would have thought, and hard.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it is kind of thankless and hard. I would say that, there's a lot of failure in this space. It is very difficult when you're, one of a relatively small number of little NGOs that are trying to fight the good fight against these massive, very well-funded corporations who have huge law firms that defend them and are willing to spend just extraordinary amounts of money. It's not surprising that we lose a lot more than we win. And so those kind of repeated losses, I think, can be exhausting for me, but also for all of my staff and for all of the field. There was a really great study a few years ago on mental health in the human rights sphere. I don't know if Meg Satterthwaite, if you read this study, it was fascinating. It came after these suicides in Amnesty, and then they commissioned this study. It's a fascinating study that kind of goes through and talks about just kind of how traumatized everybody in the field is. She talks about these different sort of personality types, like the cowboy, these sort of like, human rights folks that are really rough and tumble, but that's also itself a trauma response. So yeah, I think that it is really hard. Everybody is experiencing a huge amount of vicarious trauma. And then we're also coming out of this long, terrible, isolating pandemic. And so these things layered on top of each other, I see in myself, but also in my staff, just a lot of struggling with all of these sort of layered issues. And the kind of self-care narrative, like, oh, if you just do yoga a couple times a week and meditate occasionally, you're going to be fine. I think you probably do need to do yoga a couple times a week. You probably do need to meditate every day, and you're still not fine. So I would say that like a more meaningful thing in terms of thinking about your work life or your educational life, and even your home life, is how are you a real agent in your life in all of these spaces? If you're working in an extremely hierarchical space in which you cannot come and contribute your best self, you can't sort of bring out the skills that you have and the abilities that you have in their fullness in all of the spaces in which you operate, that is really demoralizing. You should think about going somewhere else. And so we really try to create a space where everyone is as fully supported and there's as much trust as possible so that everybody on my staff is also a leader. We have a modified consensus process. And part of that is because I want everyone to be the boss. We're all the boss. They're responsible to me and I'm accountable to them as well. And there's mutual supervision. And so that kind of like agency in your life really can help you get back up, because you can say, I don't like this thing about my work, I'm going to change it. And you can.
It sounds really enlightened, and I'm sure there's a bunch of people that want you as their boss right now, or wishing they had you as their boss right now. And you always have so much energy. You're so inspirational. I'm curious, have there been, are there heroes, not mentors, but heroes that have inspired you, either contemporary or historical?
You know, when I think about people who really inspired me, it's less famous people. There is this woman, Ruth Carter, who, when I was in prison, she was across the alley from me. So we were in these long alleys of bunks. She was across the alley from me. She had a 28-year sentence on a first-time nonviolent drug offense. And she was one of the most grounded, sane humans when she was living in a completely insane place for decades. And I think that watching her and the way that she can operate within a context of insanity and maintain a strong sense of self, she was really a hero in that way.
Wow. Did you stay in touch, or
a little bit?
What happened to Ruth Carter?
Ruth was eventually released, and she was like living her life and doing the best she can. But I think a lot of people are so harmed by being in prison that they come out and it's really hard to get back up. Ruth is not one of those. Despite this extraordinary sentence, she has managed to recover to a certain extent.
And you've not just recovered, you've thrived. And it sounds like prison, anti-sweatshop movement being a one huge sort of sliding doors moment for you, but prison sounds like a huge light bulb moment for you. How did you get into prison? Tell us about that. I mean, normally I ask, was there, a consequential sort of fork in the road for people that made them choose a business and human rights career? It sounds like you were already on that BHR path because of your anti-sweatshop movement activism. The prison experience was part of that, though, wasn't it? Is that right? Is that how you got into prison? And if you don't mind me prying, what led you to, find yourself in prison? How was that experience? And you've clearly channeled that into, positivity and constructive life and work. Is that has that been deliberate on your part?
It's a big multifaceted question. I'll do my best. So the School of the Americas, as a target of civil disobedience, it's a training camp for Latin American soldiers that was in Georgia in the United States. And, it had a long, terrible history. It trained 11 of Latin America's dictators, many serious human rights abusers. The movement against the School of the Americas was founded by a priest who was tortured in Bolivia by a School of the Americas graduate. So there's a long history of especially Catholic social movement organizers targeting this school. So that year that I went to get arrested, there were about 85 of us, including nuns and priests and many others, who trespassed onto the base as an act of protest. This kind of goes back to the story earlier about Dole and the flower workers, and this idea that, if you live in a country, are you holding your own government and your own corporations accountable for what they do elsewhere in the world? And if not, why not? And so this idea of really pushing the envelope with U.S. training of foreign militaries and really problematic practices is something that, I think it's important for all of us as citizens to look at our own governments and what we are doing as we also critique other governments. We just need to look at it with sort of an equal eye. And so this, 2002, a group of 85 of us get arrested. Most of us went to prison, not at the same time or the same places. So I wasn't with my co-defendants. They sent me to a federal prison that was a work camp in Pekin, Illinois. I got 6 months and a year of probation and a fine. During those 6 months, I drove a forklift. I worked in what they called the safety department. There was a Unicor factory, which is the trade name of federal prison industries. And they made cages for immigrants at the Unicor factory that had an escape-proof guarantee that we would affix to the outside. So I took the leftover scrap metal from the cage building, and we would sit there in a pole barn with a magnet and separate the steel from the aluminum because they could be recycled for different amounts and the prison could make money doing that. And I drove this forklift over to the men's facility, and I would pick up their scrap metals and bring it over to the women's facility and separate it there. They paid me 12 cents an hour for the pleasure of doing this, which is, you can say, well, but you have your food and you have your housing. But the reality is in prison, they have a very expensive commissary and the food is almost inedible. So people are buying jars of peanut butter and other things on the commissary just to get by. If you don't want to wear steel-toed boots all day, every day, you have to buy your tennis shoes. So it's really a racket. I would say that experience coming out of it, first of all, it was very rough. And it was also absolutely forced labor. This is domestic U.S. I was 22. Yeah.
Forced labor. Sorry, go on.
When you look at the ILO indicators of forced labor, this absolutely qualifies. This is abuse of vulnerability. This is abuse of working and living conditions. This is menace of penalty. If you don't work, you get solitary confinement. It's a pretty serious penalty for not working. So here in the US, we have forced labor in our prisons. And so when I talked earlier about Section 307 and the prohibition on the importation of forced labor produced goods, we also just put out a report on domestic prison labor here in the United States, looking at that through the lens of the 11 ILO indicators of forced labor, just because we need to have some consistency there. Yeah. Right.
And you can speak from experience too. Yeah. Now, you wear your prison experience as a badge of honor now, though. You've really turned it into a positive.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, here in the US, it's such a common experience, right? We have this extraordinarily large prison population, and as a percentage of our population, it's the largest in the world. We have a major mass incarceration problem in this country. And so the number of people that you might run into here in the US, particularly if you're a person of color, that have been incarcerated, on probation, in contact with the system in some way, very high. So, I mean, in a way, I think that it's kind of a normal American experience to be incarcerated at some point. Now, I think being incarcerated for civil disobedience is maybe a little bit more unusual, but I think there's something to be said for normalizing that experience, acknowledging how common it is, and that it could really happen to a lot of different people. And so when we think about prison conditions and prison labor, it's actually everybody's problem. We all need to be thinking about this and working on it and improving it, because it could happen to you or your son or your cousin or someone that you know.
Right. And just a very pragmatic one for perhaps some of those listening. Did your prison time have any impact on you being admitted to the bar or ability to practice law?
Ooh, Jonathan, it sure did. It was very difficult. It wasn't just that. It was, I went to a protest a few years later and was just randomly grabbed. Sometimes they'll pen people in at a protest and arrest them. That happened while I was in law school. And then I also served a subpoena on the former president of Colombia, and he accused me, this is Uribe, when he was a professor at Georgetown Law while I was in law school. He accused me of assault. I did not touch that man, for the record. But so when I was trying to get admitted to the bar, I not only had my prison background, I had a more recent arrest, and I also had a pending criminal investigation for assault
from
on former President Uribe. Yeah. So no, it was tough. It was tough to get admitted, but I did. Yeah. And I've been admitted in multiple jurisdictions now. So it was rocky. So I think there certainly is a tension between activism and bar admission. However, I don't regret any of it, and I wouldn't give any of it back.
Yeah, awesome. We have only a few minutes remaining. It'd be remiss of me not to acknowledge that last line in your CV, though, about your that you have 2 kids as well. Balancing parenthood is hard. At the best of times, you've just gone through COVID. You're in a very challenging, cutting-edge type of role at Corporate Accountability Lab. Any tips for the rest of us? How the hell do you do it?
Yeah, it's super hard. I would say one tip is that organizational policies should be consistent across the board for people with and without children, which is to say, you should just assume if you're in a position of working in an organization or running an organization, the policies you should advocate for from whatever position you're in should assume that everyone has small children or that everyone has an elderly parent at home they have to care for, or that everyone has some outside of work responsibilities. And basically what this does is it promotes sufficient work-life balance that anyone can come into your organization and can thrive there. And it's not that you need special exceptions for parents. It's that everyone should have a workload that allows them to be a parent. Now, that doesn't mean it's not hard. It's super hard, but I think that some of that leveling the playing field means that it's a lot easier to be a parent. I also, when I was founding the organization, this was a big consideration for me because my kids were 1 and 3 when I was starting Cal, which was pretty tough, but I had worked in a law firm where it was merciless. Right. I was, on Christmas Eve doing telephonic hearings, working until 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night on discovery. Right. This is how law firms are structured. And it's abusive and no one should tolerate it. And if incoming associates at firms did not tolerate this, eventually law firms would have to change their practice. And to a certain extent, they are. But I think that folks coming in really should be demanding. People talk a lot of smack about millennials and whatever the new generation is being too demanding in the workplace. And I say be demanding. Don't let employers take advantage of you. Full stop.
I sense another third-party beneficiary lawsuit, perhaps against the legal industry.
Way to bring it back.
All right. How about we round off with some fun questions? Favorite ice cream flavor?
Strawberry cheesecake or cookie dough.
Favorite pizza topping?
Pineapple.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I know, controversial, but real.
Favorite Star Wars movie?
I kind of like the first 3. I hated the new versions, but now there's like a million spinoffs that all of my kids are into. I don't know when you ask that question if you're talking about the breadth of the Star Wars world, but it's overwhelming.
I asked
I'm just going to say Empire Strikes Back and walk away.
Yay! That's my favorite too. How do you relax? You mentioned yoga a few times a week, and
I do yoga. I do meditate. I do a lot of walking. I do a lot of just having really deep conversations with my girlfriends. I think is really important to me.
Awesome. Favorite human rights movie or sustainability movie that has moved you?
That's a good one. You know what I really like is if you've seen the Rotten series on Netflix. Have you seen that?
No.
It's a whole series and they go into different industries. They've got one on cocoa that's very good. You should watch that. A lot of my colleagues are in it.
I don't have Netflix.
Wow, you're the only one left.
You referred to telephonic meetings just before. Everyone's Googling that. What the hell are those?
That's hilarious. No, but the Netflix Rotten series is very good and it's worth checking out.
Cool. And old-fashioned literature, any books, business and human rights book recommendations that you might have?
Business and human rights books? I try to really stick to novels exclusively.
Okay. And just to close, some really light, soft touch questions. What's next for you? You've founded a really innovative organization. You've gone to prison. You've come out of it. You've pursued some of the biggest companies on the planet. You've well-traveled person. What's next for you personally?
Yeah, well, I'm about to start doing teaching courses in adjunct at Northwestern in the spring, which I think will be an interesting kind of development. And I think a lot of my energy now is really focused on thinking really creatively about how we can, as an organization, be constantly adapting to this ever-changing world in which we are. It's a hard thing to do, and so I might even take a sabbatical and think about how do you create a system of constant agility. Rather than finding the answer, how do we always be in a space where we're finding the many answers? And how do we design organizations around that principle?
Change is the soul. What? Hang on. Change is
the soul
constant. Yeah, or the soul constant. Wow, I mungled that. What's the future for business and human rights in your mind, or corporate accountability? Are you hopeful? Are you optimistic? Or you started off with a very pessimistic note about the lack of corporate accountability. What do you see for the future?
I do think there's some hope in all these due diligence bills that are really moving. I don't know if I see a lot of hope in the binding treaty. I think that's kind of questionable. But I think that the more third pillar, the more kind of litigation risk we can create, that's going to push companies to be more engaged, to maybe not lobby so hard against regulation, et cetera. So if we can really build up the third pillar, I think that's going to end up creating spaces where the first and second pillar and a lot of other corporate accountability and business and human rights activity can improve over current standards.
Fantastic. Thank you for all the wisdom that you've just imparted, and for sharing your personal story and the story of Cal. Charity, thank you for propping up Pillar 3 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Is there anything else? I just want to give you the floor. Is there anything you wanted to get off your chest or share with the audience before we close this out?
There's not, but I think this is really great that you're doing this podcast, Jonathan. This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you so much, Charity, for your time, and thank you for making the world a better place.